if you get an apartment with one parking space, it could be that $400 of your rent is paying for that parking space. It seems free, but it has to be paid for somehow. And if it's required for housing, it goes into the rent. So we end up having free parking and expensive housing, which is the wrong way around.
Today, we're going to talk about parking, how we organize it, how we regulate it, build it, and pay for it. We have three really great guests on the program today. One from the city government, Katia Balassiano, one from the Ulupono initiative, Katie Rooney, and our first guest who'll be joining me now is internationally renowned UCLA planning professor, Donald Shoup. He's an expert on transportation, public finance, and land economics. He's the author of the landmark book, The High Cost of Free Parking. And I really like this. The Wall Street Journal has called him a parking rock star, which is very fitting. So in our preparation for today's event, it also came out that Don has some very important ties to Hawaii. He lived here as a child during World War II and was recalling the bombing of Pearl Harbor. He also came back to the University of Hawaii at Manoa to teach in the economics department in the 1970s. So he has some ties to the university, which is great. From there, he went on to have a very distinguished career, mainly at UC Los Angeles, and we're really pleased to have him on the program today. So let's get started. Welcome, Don.
Well, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for sending the lei that I'm wearing. I thought you would all have leis on as well.
Well, you're a distinguished guest, so it's really nice to have you, and thank you for your time and expertise on this topic. I want to start with just unpacking the title of your book, right? The High Cost of Free Parking. Can you explain that title a bit? How can something that is both free be costly?
Well, I think that it is free. Parking is free to most of us most of the time. But just because the driver doesn't pay for it doesn't mean the cost goes away. The cost is still there. That somebody has to pay for it, and that somebody is everybody. The one example that I think is prominent in Honolulu in your current thinking is how it affects the price of housing. When cities require each apartment to have one or two or even three parking spaces, then that cost can be very high in Hawaii. Land is very expensive and construction is very expensive. Ulupono sponsored research on the cost of housing and parking, and they found that just one parking space cost about $110 a month, up to $410 a month, depending on whether it's on the surface or in a structure. So if you get an apartment with one parking space, it could be that $400 of your rent is paying for that parking space. It seems free. But it has to be paid for somehow. And if it's required for housing, it goes into the rent. So we end up having free parking and expensive housing, which is the wrong way around. And everything has a parking requirement. Say grocery stores have a parking requirement. And the cost of the parking has to go into the price of the food. So people who are too poor to own a car have to pay for parking so that the richer drivers can park free at the grocery store. So I think that the cost gets spread around in the wrong way.
Thanks, Don. Can you share a little bit about your perspective about how did we get here? How did we get to that state, right? When we look at an aerial view of many U.S. cities, this is how they look in terms of, just extraordinary amounts of land being dedicated to parking. How much land is dedicated to parking, and how did that come to be?
Well, nobody knows exactly how much land is devoted to parking, but when you look around, you'll see it's a lot. In LA, it's about 20% of all the land in the city is devoted to parking. That's the only city I know where somebody has really tried to add it all up. Say in downtown LA, if you spread all the parking spaces out in a parking lot, it would cover 90% of the downtown. So I think that planners didn't impose this on unwilling residents. It's a democratic process. Everyone wants to park free, including me. But that doesn't mean we should make free parking a principle of land use planning and public finance. The parking requirements began to spread just after World War II, when the country was prosperous and everybody had cars. It just seemed natural that we should require every new land use to have plenty of parking, because we assumed that people would have cars. But that reduced the cost of parking so much, it increased the number of cars we wanted and the more we wanted to use them. So I think it slowly accumulated, and it seemed to be natural that everybody should be able to find a free parking space wherever they go. And planners have been able to produce that with minimum parking requirements.
Can you describe that for our audience a little bit? I'm not sure everybody knows what a minimum parking requirement is. And this is a major thing that you talk about frequently in terms of ripe for parking reform. Can you talk about what minimum parking requirements are and maybe how they are similar and different in different settings, for example, for commercial areas versus residential?
Well, every city has pages of parking requirements. Is it for a nail salon? How many parking spaces are needed before you get permission to open the nail salon? That you simply cannot open a restaurant without all the required number of spaces. So when you look at the pages and pages of parking requirements, they look very scientific, sort of like some scientific table with very precise numbers, like 3 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet. But there's not much thought that has gone into those. That, as you know, in a planning program, that we never teach our students how to set a parking requirement, because we don't know how to do it ourselves. But when the students get a job, they find out they have to begin enforcing the parking requirements. That before anything can open or be built, they have to. The home builder has to show, or the developer has to show, that they have all the parking spaces that the city requires. So it's a very very precise but highly inaccurate planning process.
So you talked about some of those hidden costs, right? When you make parking free to everybody, but the costs get hidden into the development and then eventually down to the consumers, whether it be homeowners or renters or commercial customers. What are the other hidden costs that are involved in minimum parking requirements? Can you talk about some of the environmental aspects, or just how does it affect how we experience our cities?
Well, I think the initial error is, it sounds counterintuitive, but it's leaving the curb parking free. If cities want to leave the curb parking free and not have a shortage, they have to require a lot of off-street parking, because people don't want to arrive at their destination and find all the curb spaces occupied. So I think the origin of the problem started out with our underpricing of curb parking. And it's hard to tell people that they should charge more for parking. But you ask how it spreads. And I'd say that, well, you learned as a kid the famous poem on the For Want of a Nail, that for want of a nail, a horseshoe nail, the shoe was lost, the horseshoe was lost. For loss of the shoe, the horse was lost. And for the loss of the horse, the rider was lost. And for loss of the rider, the message was lost. And for loss of the message, the battle was lost. And for loss of the battle, the kingdom was lost. So something small, seems small, can be very big. So I'd say that for lack of an open parking space, there's a shortage of parking. So cities require off-street parking. And then if they require off-street parking, that spreads land uses apart because there are parking spaces between the buildings. And then that means the cars are more necessary to where you're going. It's harder to walk and to bicycle if there's a lot of traffic and things are far apart. So I think that, and then for all that traffic causes air pollution, now we worry about carbon emissions. So I think it seems hard to believe that a small thing like the lack of an open parking spaces can spiral into global warming. But I think it has, that we have so much parking, and car is the natural way to get to most places. That we just take it for granted, and we expect to park free when we get there. So I'd say that the original sin was mismanaging the curb parking.
Okay, let's talk about that a little more. I like the framing of the original sin, right? So this is the root of the problem. Can you talk about this idea of cheap on-street parking, right? How did we get there as a principle? And, one of the things I've seen you argue a lot in your work is that free street parking actually leads to congestion. Can you talk about that a little bit for our audience?
Yes, well, the parking meter wasn't invented until about 1935, so it was hard to price parking at all. And most parking spaces are not metered. They're free. There may be a time limit, but most parking spaces are free. And I think that that's what we want. Everybody wants free parking, but when it's in a crowded area and you get to your location, you have to drive around hunting for parking, cruising for parking. I and other people starting in 1927 and looked at what percentage of the traffic is cruising. You can't look at the traffic and know who's cruising for parking. You don't know the driver's motives. But studies that have done on 4 continents over now 90 years found that on average in congested areas where all the curb spaces are occupied, about 30% of all the cars are hunting for parking. Say that is if somebody hunting for parking, their car was painted yellow. You would see 1 out of 7 cars would be yellow. So in some areas, at the highest, something like 87% of all the cars were cruising. So I think it's between 0 and 100% of the cars are cruising. But if you're in a downtown congested area where the traffic is heavy and slow moving and all the curb spaces are occupied and free, most of the traffic may be cruising for parking. And the solution that planners have offered to this is to require off-street parking so you won't drive around hunting for curb parking. You just pull off into a parking lot and it's free. So I think that the original sin of charging nothing for curb parking is what has led to many of the mistakes that we have made.
So instead of responding to the problem of underpriced curb parking with off-street parking, something you've proposed a lot is better pricing parking. You use this term performance pricing. Can you talk about what that looks like and how do you set these pricing rates?
Well, some cities have done this, a growing number of cities, and I hope Honolulu will become one of them. But it was Washington, D.C. when they started, they called it performance-based parking prices because they wanted the parking to perform well. If there were 1 out of, and to do that, you charge the lowest price the city could charge and still have 1 or 2 open spaces. That is, the city council makes the decision on the occupancy rate they want. And it's up to the staff to set the prices to achieve the goal. Seattle has that in its city charter now. The staff is responsible for setting curb parking prices. The city council doesn't have to go through endless meetings of whether you should raise the price of curb parking 25 cents and hear people arguing for it and against it. It's a staff decision. And most people don't even know the prices are changing. They don't change every day. Usually they say San Francisco has the biggest program, but they change every 3 months. And they have different prices at different times of day. So if you have the same price all day long, it'll be too high at some times and too low at others. So they have different prices at different times of day. And it's different prices on different blocks because There's a different demand on every block. So it's essentially the lowest price the city could charge and still have one or two open spaces. And when San Francisco started this, first with 7,000 parking meters as a pilot program, and then all of the city after that, all the city meters after that, I got my biggest surprise is that the prices didn't go up on average. They actually declined by 4% in the first 3 years. And that's because the parking was so overpriced in the morning. There were a lot of empty spaces in the morning. And they changed the price every 3 months. And it took 3 years for the price to get down to 25 cents an hour. And other parts of town, it went up to $6 an hour. In the congested areas downtown. But on average, all the prices declined by about 4%, which means they stayed the same. So it just means the prices moved around. The prices were down in some areas at some times and up in other areas at other times. So I think that's then the parking performs well. It's well used. Most of the spaces are occupied, but it's readily available, and you can't do anything better than that. But I think that, as you say, it's not the easiest thing to do, but the technology now makes it possible. Most people think of the parking meters like the first ones that were introduced in 1935. And you put your money in the meter and you hope to get back before your time runs out. Now, how many payment mechanisms have not changed since 1935? But that's what parking meters are. It hasn't gotten any better in 85 years. But the technology, unfortunately, most of it comes from abroad. In parts of the world where they do charge for parking, has made it very easy. You can set prices. You don't have to touch the meters. They operate by looking at the license plate of the car. You don't pay for parking. Your license plate does. And they can the enforcement people can just look around and see, has that license plate paid for parking? So I think that the parking, if the parking performs well, the business will perform well, because nobody will say there's a shortage of parking, and they'll be able to employ more people, and the prices will go up and down automatically. But most people won't know what the price was 3 months ago, and they won't even know that the prices are changing. That's another thing that surprised me. Once they started, there was very little discussion of it. Occasionally, I get invited to talk on talk shows at cities that started it, and I think once in San Francisco it was that this would probably apply to Honolulu. That I mentioned the fact that San Francisco allows the price to go at the meters to go up to $18 an hour during special events. And I asked, well, why is that? They said, well, that's what the private operators charge. That we'd have to charge that in order to prevent cruising. And so, and I mentioned the big events like the Pride Parade in San Francisco. And somebody called in and said, well, I like what Professor Shoup says, but does he think that SF Park, the program, is going to prevent cruising at the Pride Parade? I think not. So I think that cruising, I meant to have it as a double meaning, but that there's good cruising and bad cruising, I suppose. But the bad cruising, if you get rid of that, it'll be the good cruising could happen more easily. So, and say in Washington D.C. At football games, during the game they charge $8 an hour, but before and after the game, it's a lower price. So they hope that people will come early and have lunch in the area, and stay for the game, and after the game, stay for dinner and walk around. So there won't be a crush of cars trying to come in at the last minute and out at the last minute. So I think that we can adjust the prices to have the system perform better.
You talked a little bit about the technology that enables this, right, in more modern parking systems. Can you talk a little bit more about that and things you see on the horizon? But I'm also curious about this idea of setting pricing, right? Because it seems to me like you're moving away from parking rates being the policy decision, but rather setting parameters for parking performance being the policy decision, and then rates get set within that. So are there examples where these rates are set more automatedly? And how does that work?
Well, it's not automatic. Nobody is recommending that the prices change hour by hour, or that when it gets crowded, the price goes up. What they do is the technology that really makes this possible is occupancy sensor. You have to be able to know what the occupancy rate is at the curb. And there are various ways to do that, and they're getting better and cheaper all the time. I guess that's one thing I'm saying, is that the technology has improved so much in the past few years and has gotten so much cheaper that all this is possible. But if you know what the occupancy is in every space, on every block, then the algorithms kick in. And every 3 months in San Francisco, they look at what happened in the last 3 months. And if they see on some blocks, it was fully occupied in the afternoon, they'll raise the price in the afternoon. They just adjust it by 25 cents an hour. So there's a limit. I don't think that's necessary, but that's their limit. And the price will go down by 25 cents an hour. So you just look at what has been happening and you say, well, we should raise the price. Or if we have too many empty spaces, we should lower the price. And so in Los Angeles, where we do it, all the data is sent to France, to Xerox, and they are very specialized in setting prices, and they send back the recommended prices for the next month, and the city can take them or leave them. But I think that individual cities like Honolulu don't have to master all this technology, because there are companies that will do it all for you. For San Francisco, all of the software and hardware was done by private operators. You can't expect city staff to know all about the best technology or the most sophisticated prices, but you can contract that out. So I think it's the technology and the software and the wetware. I mean, you have to have people who understand it as well. I think it's now makes it possible that Honolulu or any other city would not be a pioneer. There are lots of other cities. In fact, when I was talking to you a couple of days ago, I suggested that somebody asked me what the state could do, and I said, well, what the state could do is look at the legislation in other cities that have these variable prices for parking: Calgary and Washington, D.C., and Boston, and San Francisco, and L.A., and other cities in Europe. The state could look at this legislation. You could choose it. And then after I got off the message with you, I said, well, I could do that. I could, because I have a lot of the legislation. All of what would be very useful, I think, for cities would be to say, well, here's the legislation in San Francisco. Here's how it works. There are books about what has happened in San Francisco, but I don't know that they include just the legislative language. See, I looked at the parking requirements for Honolulu, and I think the reforms you've done recently are very good. But you had to do it sort of on your own. And I think for this pricing, I think you wouldn't want to do that from scratch. You would just say, well, who did it for San Francisco, or who did it for LA, or who did it for Boston? And then there's great economies of scale, because if a city has done it for 25 other cities, that they could do it for you.
So we're getting some really interesting questions in the chat, and I want to turn to some of our audience questions, that a couple that are very relevant. So the first is really around this question of equity and implications of moving towards parking reform and pricing reform for on-street parking. To what extent does this impact equity? The question is equity and diversity when you remove free parking. And the participant has given an example that I want to bring in. So this year, the participant visited San Diego and went to Pacific Beach, Mission Beach near Balboa, and there was free parking. So the beach was congested, but the people at the beach were every kind of people, a very diverse group. And you went down to an area without free parking, and they didn't see that same kind of diversity. So how would you address this question of equity in regards to parking pricing reform?
Well, no place in San Diego has free parking at the beach, but there are parts of town that do have parking meters. I mean, this is a complaint about parking meters, not the performance pricing. But I think that is a very important question. I have several answers, as you can imagine. For the pricing on the street, that the cities can give a discount to low-income people, just as they give a lifeline rate for electricity, natural gas, and water to low-income people. They could give a discounted parking rate to low-income people. And that means the parking wouldn't be free to everybody. It would be free or cheap only to low-income people. So you don't have to give free parking to the well-off in order in a misguided attempt to help the poor. I think it's a very, very bad way to think. This is a good anti-poverty program is to have free curb parking. I think it's much better to make the parking cheap for low-income people. But I wouldn't stop at that. I say if you're giving a subsidy to low-income drivers, you should also give the same subsidies to low-income people who can't afford a car. I think it's very unfair to give a subsidy to drivers who are poor and nothing to people who are too poor to own a car. So I think it would be fairer to give a discount to low-income people for parking, if the parking prices are very high. And anyway, it's just parking. It isn't as though it's like food or it's housing. It's not a big expenditure. It's a small expenditure. And when it comes to parking requirements, cities, certainly in California, they almost all give allow lower parking requirements for low-income housing. That we say that you shouldn't, that if there's a specific group of people you want to help, you shouldn't give it to everybody. You shouldn't give free parking to everybody. So I think that equity will be served by, especially for people who are too poor to own a car, who walk where they go or take transit. I mean, should they get nothing? I think Boulder, Colorado has a very good program as they put in their parking meters, and they offer free transit passes for everybody who works downtown. So it's the parking meters downtown that pay for the free transit passes. So all the downtown employers give a free fringe benefit to their employees. If you work for me, you get a free transit pass. It's not at my cost. So richer drivers who come to downtown pay for transit for the people who work there. I think that's a lot fairer than what we have now, which is free parking for everybody goes to downtown. And then there's a nightmare of cruising and breathing exhaust as you hunt around for a parking space. And so yes, I think that that if you're careful about how you spend the money, that's important. And I guess the third thing I recommend, one is to charge the right price for curb parking, and second is to remove off-street parking requirements. I think that the kingpin there, is something every city should do, is to tell every neighborhood that if you charge market prices for curb parking, performance-based prices, that all the meter revenue will go to pay for public services on the metered streets. Say that if your business district or your neighborhood charges market prices for curb parking, all that revenue will repair your sidewalks. We'll plant street trees, we'll clean the sidewalks, we'll remove graffiti overnight. Some cities give free Wi-Fi to everybody. And I think that if free Wi-Fi becomes identified with parking meters around the world, I mean, we're talking about very first world problems right now. But if it's in India or Pakistan, that if they understand that, yes, here's a way to improve the city, to get the cars off the sidewalks, which you see everywhere in India and Pakistan and even China. If we get all the cars off the sidewalks and eliminate cruising, so the buses will operate faster. Yes, and most poor people take the bus, so the buses won't be held up by cars hunting for a free parking space. Then I think it'll be very fair. I think, if I can remember it, I think that there are 4 situations that altogether were paid parking and parking benefit districts, a district that collects the money. If most people don't own a car, like there would be in India, and if the people who do own cars are higher income, and if the area is congested, then I think this parking benefit district would be a good idea. But let's get back to Honolulu. I think that, that there is a precedent in Los Angeles that I hope will serve for Honolulu. That Pasadena, California was the old town in the 1980s was a commercial skid row. It had wonderful buildings in terrible condition. And they wanted a lot of public improvements. They wanted all new sidewalks. They wanted street trees, historic street furniture. They wanted the alleys cleaned up, but they had no way to pay for it. And then the city said, well, if we will pay for all of these if we put in parking meters. And the merchants had previously opposed parking meters, but as soon as they said the city said the money would come back, the merchant said, well, why didn't you tell us that? Let's run the meters on Sunday. Let's run them till midnight. Let's charge a high price. The only thing that changed was that they knew that the money was coming back for what they wanted. So I would say in Honolulu, if you say that you don't have any skid rows that I remember, but even commercial areas like where the old Pasadena had now a business improvement district that actually contracted for all the street cleaning, the sidewalk cleaning. So if you told the Waikiki Business Improvement District that if we charge these performance prices, all the revenue will go to the Waikiki Business Improvement District to pay for clean. What they do is make things clean and safe, but also beautiful. There'll be much better landscaping. That's a very different story from telling Waikiki that we want to charge high prices during the high season and low prices during the low season and high prices during festivals and things like that. And the money was going to go to the city of Honolulu. They'd probably say no. But if they knew the money was going to come back to their neighborhood, then the merchants, who are usually sensible about money, will say, well, yes, this makes sense. We won't have to pay anything, but we'll get a lot of good public services. So I think that's a new model of the world. Instead of having free parking and poor public services, we have paid parking and better public services, instead of just having paid parking and nothing else.
A couple of follow-up questions, and I also want to sneak in a few more audience questions before our time is up. This is so interesting, Don. So a couple of questions in terms of, you talked a lot about how this is relevant to commercial areas like Waikiki, particularly this idea of a parking improvement district, I think is very appealing because it starts to solve some of that. What do you do with the revenue, right? And some of maybe the political backlash to parking reforms. How do you, in Hawaii, one of the parking challenges we also have are just very much outside of the commercial areas, but in our beachfront communities, which are very residential, but with lots of visitors from visitors from outside of Hawaii, but also from around the island. So how would you see parking reform playing a role in kind of much more residential communities?
Well, we have permit districts for that. Vancouver, Canada, has a new program that most of these parking permit districts have free or very cheap permits for the residents. And you have as many as you want. But there are areas that are very crowded, and there are not enough curb spaces for everybody who lives there. So that you get a permit, but that doesn't guarantee you a space. So what Vancouver is as raising the price of the permits. I think the first went up to about $500 a year. But very cleverly, they said that everybody is grandfathered. Everybody who already lives there and has a permit, they get to keep the permit for at the same $35 a month. It's only newcomers who have to pay the $500 a month, a year. I'm sorry. It's sort of a welcome strangers policy. Is that everybody who's already there gets to keep their free permit, but newcomers have to pay the lowest price that will yield some vacant spaces. And then there's something specific to Honolulu that I would recommend is that it happens in tourist areas, and of course Honolulu is unique. But in Miami Beach, they have a lot of tourists from the north, and they had crowded curb parking. And they wanted to put in parking meters, and they have a very clever system that they charge you by license plate. It's your license plate that pays the number, pays the shows that you paid for parking. You can pay for it with online with your cell phone, and some new cars, the app is in the dashboard. The dashboard is the one that pays for the parking because it knows its license plate and its location. But the meters say you could also pay the meters $4 an hour. But unknown to the visitors, anybody who has a Miami Beach license plate pays only $1 an hour. So it's like Monty Python's idea to solve Britain's economic problems is to tax foreigners living abroad. So if you thought all the tourists would be going to Waikiki and they would say that they would see the meter said $6 an hour, they would pay for it and stay maybe for a shorter time than they otherwise would. But then when they leave, the space will be available to others. And they don't know that the residents are paying a much lower price. So I think that it's like a tax on rental cars or a tax on hotels. As you try to tax the tourists, and the easier way to do this is to give a discount for residents. I think that would be very easy to do. And everybody who rents a car and drives around, they don't know what's happening. But if you have maps showing what the price of parking is, that they'll think twice about driving a car to Waikiki. Maybe they should take the bus.
Thank you. It's really interesting, this idea of a two-tiered pricing system. A couple of questions have come in that I think are really important. So one is a question around disability access. I think this is more relevant to sort of more dense urban areas, but disability access and also things like loading zones. How do you see parking reforms interfacing with those issues?
Well, I think it would be much better for people with physical disabilities because there will be vacant curb spaces where they want to go. And some cities reserve the first, the end spaces on the block for disabled permits because it's easy to get into and out of a space on the end. So I think it would make the spaces much more available because if you're a disabled person driving around and around hunting for a parking space, that doesn't help you. And I think that when if you get rid of parking requirements, that doesn't mean you get rid of disabled parking spaces. Some cities say that they have to provide disabled parking spaces at the same rate they would have had before the parking permits were parking requirements were removed. So they're removed for able-bodied people, but they will remain for people with disabilities.
Maybe a last question. I know we're about at time, but there's a question about, can you talk a little bit more about this idea that by removing the minimum parking requirement, and I think you're talking about this very broadly, not necessarily just in dense urban areas. Can you talk about how maybe what empirical knowledge there is or examples there are about how that might reduce housing prices and increase affordability?
Well, I'd start with an example that if you have two otherwise identical apartments in the same building, and one of them comes with a parking space and the other one doesn't come with a parking space, that nobody would expect that the two apartments would have the same rent. The lower rent for the apartment without a parking space is a discount on housing for somebody who doesn't have a car. So I think that it just the way the market works, that apartments without housing, without parking, apartments without parking have to rent for less than the same apartment with a parking space. But say several cities have gotten rid of parking requirements everywhere. Buffalo, Hartford, Connecticut, Edmonton in Canada, that's their Houston in Canada, and they eliminated all parking requirements, and Berkeley and Minneapolis. And so there's now some experience as to what happens. And the first article written about it was for Buffalo, which was the first city to remove them everywhere. And instead of the pages of parking requirements that you have in Honolulu, and they had it in Buffalo, there's just one sentence that no parking is required for development in Buffalo. But after 4 years, Daniel Hess and their planning department surveyed about 50 buildings, and some of them provided more than had previously been required, because a minimum used to be that you had to provide at least that, and some would always provide more. Say if it's for high-income people who have a lot of cars, the home builder will provide more parking. But some of after the parking requirements were removed, some buildings continued to provide more parking than previously allowed. Many of them provided a bit less, and a few of them provided none. So maybe 4 out of 50 provided none. And those were low-income housing that wouldn't have been possible if they had to provide parking. So that I think the first thing, as you know, that when planning students learn when they're in our planning department, the professors teach them nothing about how to set parking requirements because they know nothing about how to set parking requirements. You or I could not set the parking requirements for a nail salon, but our students, when they graduate, they have to enforce these laws. And I think once you get rid of it, the decisions are shifted down to a lower level where the home builder knows how the parking spaces will increase the cost of the building. And they're the ones who make the decision. So I think that shifting the decisions to people who actually are doing the work is the best way to go about it, instead of having a top-down solution as to we know how much parking that you have to provide, or we will not let you build that housing.
So you mentioned the parking reforms that we recently had in Honolulu, and we're going to be talking about that more with our next speaker Katia Balassiano. But I want to give you one last word, Don. So if you have a last recommendation for things for Honolulu and Hawaii more broadly as a state to think about in terms of parking reform, what would you say?
Well, here's a Shoup dogma. I was very happy when the Wall Street Journal called me a parking rock. I'll change my name to Shoup Dog. But I also have a Shoup dogma. This dogma has 3 points. One is to remove all street parking requirements. The second is to charge the right price for curb parking. And the third, which is really to begin with, is to send all the meter revenue back to the metered areas. I think that those 3 are the main policies that I would recommend for Honolulu.
Great. I really want to thank you. Mahalo so much for being here and for sharing your thoughts. This was a really interesting conversation. So Professor Shoup, just thank you. I appreciate your participation, and I would like to call on Katia to come on screen.
Hello, Makena.
Hi, Katia. So quick introduction. Katia has been a tireless advocate for smarter parking policies in Honolulu and Oahu, and part of a key decision maker and planner with within the city government. and she holds a PhD in urban and regional planning from UH Manoa, and has taught at both Cornell and Iowa State University. She's currently running a division of Honolulu's Department of Planning and Permitting that administers the city zoning code and state's coastal zone management laws. So thank you, Katia, for being here. And, let's just start with a broad, from the conversation I just had with Professor Shoup, what are some of the things that we were discussing, sort of the Shoup recommendations that we got at the end that apply to Honolulu? And also, Don mentioned the recent parking reforms. Can you explain that for our listeners?
Sure. I guess the big news is our Ordinance 20-41, which was adopted by our City Council at the end of last year. But Ordinance 2041 has only to do with off-street parking and loading. So that's parking that's not on the streets, parking that's within the right-of-way. The city is doing a lot of other proactive things within the right-of-way that Don spoke about and that are, I think, worth recognizing. So, for example, we have residential parking permits that we've been implementing in Kalihi. We have a robust parklet program that allows businesses to take the stall that's in front of their business, turn it into a park or some outdoor dining. We've been building a series of bike paths. We've got bulb outs for safer pedestrian crossings. We're anticipating the growth of electric vehicles with new charging stations. And of course, by building rail, we're going to have an alternative for people to use instead of driving their own cars to town. So it's a combination of what our Department of Transportation Services is doing, and then also what our Department of Planning and Permitting is doing. So Don spoke about, removing off-street parking as one of his, three major components. I'm afraid I'm really not going to be able to speak to what to do with the meters and how to get the money back to the people who, the location of where the meters are. But in terms of removing the requirements for off-street parking, that is one of the highlights of Ordinance 20-41. It eliminates parking minimums in the urban areas where, the transit-rich urban areas, Kapolei, Ewa, and the primary urban center, the most densely developed areas. And it reduces it elsewhere. So yes, we still have a few pages of where parking is required and how much, but we wanted to approach this, somewhat cautiously and have a chance to see how it works before expanding it island-wide. But we do eliminate parking minimums in those most dense areas. We also have incentives to unbundle the parking from the cost of housing. We're hoping that's something that can address the cost of housing. We have included new incentives to substitute vehicle parking with bikes, car share, moped parking to give people more choices. We've reduced the loading requirements. After speaking with businesses, we understood that the loading requirements were too high, and so we changed that. We also allow and incentivize shared parking without a permit. So, for example, if you have a parking lot, it could be used by office and retail customers during the day, and then by residential users at night when they come home from their jobs. So how to better make use of the parking that exists. We also have new design standards to accommodate electric vehicles. And, we're accepting the fact that Lyft and Uber are in our lives, and we're going to anticipate the growth of those ride hailing and delivery services by requiring stalls for such services so that they don't clog up our, precious rights of way. We've also included new options for bike parking. We've had bike bike parking for a number of years, but we've, learned from what exists and tried to improve the design as part of this Ordinance 2041. And I think collectively, the goal was to, lower construction costs by allowing the development community to determine how much parking they truly needed. And if they didn't need as much, then, they would build accordingly. And with those lower construction costs, we're hoping that it'll make, the cost of housing more affordable. We're hoping that, the streets will become safer for pedestrians. And of course, improve the physical environment and offer transportation options. You spoke about equity issues, and I think providing people with options, how they're going to get around is an important component of that equity issue.
Okay, so I have all these questions going in my mind, Katia. That was just a great list of things. Thank you. Maybe I'll start with the question. I want to reflect a little bit about this time during the pandemic, and I'm wondering whether any of the lessons learned in terms of changing uses of public spaces like the parklets, how do you see, that moment having been sort of created now because of the situation, but also will it endure?
Well, I think that we saw people come out and want to use those streets when we did not have as many cars on them. I mean, when we were first kind of locked down and, the streets were often empty, you'd see parents and their kids go out and throw the ball around. Or, in terms of outdoor dining, we tried to, react fairly quickly and allowed the dining to take place in the public right of way for that social distancing. And people seemed to like that. I remember when we closed Kalakaua there for a few Sundays in a row, and unfortunately it was packed. Maybe it shouldn't have gone that far, but, I think it demonstrated how, people seek out one another and, want to be outside in this great climate that we have. And I think it's forced us to think hard about how we use that shared right of way, the streets, the curbs, the sidewalks. How do we make better use of that going forward?
Back to the Ordinance 20-41, are there any, can you give any anecdotes about the changes you've seen since it was enacted? Are, requests coming in for developments with less parking, for example, or no parking even?
Yeah, well, there hasn't been too much time. It's been about 8 months that we've had it in play, but we've definitely have had people come in who, had a, various permit with a parking requirement, and they've come in and said, hey, well, don't have that parking requirement any longer, so can we change that? So I think people are reacting positively to it. And in terms of the workload, and now we've got plan checkers who don't have to count stalls any longer to ensure that the standards are met. So I think both the public and the DPP staff are responding very positively to this. I think that we need to accumulate a little bit more data to understand how it's working, and especially if we think to ourselves that perhaps over time we can expand this island-wide. I think we probably want to see how this is working first before we, make any further changes. And your next speaker, Katie from Ulupono, perhaps she can, provide some assistance with that. It takes some time to gather the information and make sense of it. So I think that'll probably be one of those next steps that we need to do.
Great. Thanks, Katia. I think so. Last question I'll squeeze in. You're talking about the next steps, thinking about the data collection and assessment. What are some of the things in your thoughts about, more long-term working towards, and, places where the ordinance might have taken beginning steps, but maybe not gone far enough?
Yeah. Well, we take our marching orders from the long range plans that the council adopts. Those are developed with a lot of community input and thought, and kind of set a strategy for where we want to go, where we need to go. And so within those longer range plans, there are definitely some more aggressive policies that we weren't able to implement this time around. We did a lot of outreach, and this is a fairly radical change for this community. So I think there are certainly things that we accomplished that we could be very proud of, and I think go in the right direction. And then there are things that we weren't able to do this time around. And so, for example, I think that we'd probably at some point in the future want to revisit this issue of unbundling, separating the cost of the parking from the housing to give residents more options and possibly reduce housing costs. Don spoke in great deal about that. Another thing that we might want to revisit is the wrapping of parking structures with habitable spaces to better activate the streets. So instead of looking at a parking structure and seeing the cars on the inside, you'd have that wrapped with storefronts and apartments, so that the parking would be more hidden in the center, and with the windows and people entering, and it just contributes to a more lively streetscape and probably a safer one as well. We had also initially thought that we might want to increase setbacks for surface parking, so that those surface parking lots were kind of far back, and over time we could encourage infill closer to the street. So that was also, we thought, a good use of space, but the community wasn't prepared for that at this point in time. We had a bunch of advocates, and I'm so sorry that we weren't able to completely address their concerns in regards to tree planting standards. I think our surface parking lots probably would have benefited from, slightly larger tree wells. We know that the trees give us the shade, the trees thrive when there's more room, but it's always a give and take, because that takes away from potential stalls. So I think that's something to revisit. And then probably finally, the idea that parking be behind buildings instead of adjacent to the sidewalk, switching that so that the building is close to the street, the entrances to the building are available from the sidewalk. Again, that contributes to our more lively environment, safer environment. So those I think are the things that we might want to revisit at some point in the future, to see what we can do to make, the regulations a little stronger. But in the meantime, we've got other changes to the land use ordinance, our zoning code, that need to be made. So we're probably going to work ahead with those first before circling back to parking.
I want to ask you about that, but I think we're out of time. So I really want to thank you, Katia. Really thank you for all the work you do, and to your city colleagues for all of their great efforts. Thank you. And can I bring on Katie Rooney? She is the Director of Transportation Policy and Planning at the Ulupono Initiative. She's been working for over 15 years to help city and state governments across the U.S. move to more efficient, economical, and sustainable transportation. And she played a key role in advocating for smarter parking policies in Hawaii. And you're now hearing jackhammering in my neighbor's yard, but this is, this happens on Zoom. So sorry about the noise. Katie.
I can barely hear it, so I think you're okay.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for joining us, Katie. Can you talk a little bit more, from what we heard from Professor Shoup and from Katia, can you talk a little bit more about maybe, some of our ambitious climate change mitigation goals that we have in Hawaii, as well as we talked more about the affordability goals, but can you bring these things together in terms of parking policy and transportation policy more broadly?
Yeah, sure. And especially like, what do we know about it here in particular? So I think a few things that are really helpful to know is that although Dr. Shoup is very correct that most places don't have these massive inventories, we do have some estimates, and it suggests that 14% of our urban land is dedicated to streets and parking. And as most people know, land is very scarce here. It's expensive, and that's a big percentage that, not all of it is necessary for that purpose. We've valued it in one of our reports called the Vehicle Economy, that it's worth, public parking alone, the land value is about $2.2 billion per year. So, I mean, these are large amounts of land that may be available for other purposes, and frankly, more economically productive as a result. And so, not just on the affordable housing piece, which we do sort of know, Dr. Shoup also talked about how it's 110 to 410 per month per space. All of that is definitely true. And it adds to the cost of construction and then continues to sort of spiral through that system. But there's these other elements too, prices of goods, commercial activities, all these other additions. And then from like the climate side, Elemental Accelerator a few years ago put out a report called Transcending Oil, which I think a lot of folks, at least interested in this topic, might know about. And if you dig into it, it actually says that in order to shift a lot of our trips and of vehicle miles traveled, so basically the driving everybody does, parking, if you right-sized it through sort of Dr. Shoup's recommendations, we're looking at a 29% reduction in those trips. Which is huge. And I think a lot of other communities know that it has that kind of impact, but not very many have modeled them. And I think that that's really kind of a critical piece to understand how much it contributes to the way our housing is structured or the way it doesn't materialize the way we want it, why transportation isn't as rapid as we'd like it to, as convenient as we want it to. Are we dense enough for the kind of transit we want? All those types of things. And then just the general overall cost of living here. There's always lots of discussions about how to reduce the cost of housing sort of more broadly by, building on state land, and how to raise people's wages or get more money in the pocket. But we don't really talk about the cost of transportation as part of that sort of collectively in those conversations. So I think it has a lot of really sort of foundational connections that are not always apparent. So.
Thanks, Katie. I want to go back to what you said about the Transcending Oil report and this idea of just reducing trips, right? Reducing the distances that people drive. So what happens to those trips? Can you talk our audience through that a little bit? Like reduction of almost 30%, but then what, right? What are the impacts of that?
I mean, there's a whole host of options, honestly, of what happens. Sometimes the trips don't get taken. Like that's the first thing. You decide that you can trip change. So, instead of doing 2 separate trips, you are dropping your kids off at school and you hit the grocery store. That happens some of the time. Some cases people shift trips, particularly those that are 1 mile or less. If you have, if you're comfortable walking in those spaces and feel like it's comfortable and safe and all those types of things, you might walk them now, if parking is a challenge potentially. And, or if they're a little bit longer, you might bike, or you might actually just be willing to try the bus, all those types of things. And so it's sort of this collective, right? Like, people take all sorts of trips during the day. And sometimes when you start to make it so that driving is not the most convenient option under every circumstance and highly subsidized, people start to evaluate their time, their energy, the options around them. It makes you reassess and stuff like that. And what also sometimes happens is that people realize the option that they poo-pooed is frankly better than the one they gave up for a variety of reasons. Like I walk my kids to school and take the bus when I go to the office, and that's faster than most of the people who drive. So, because I don't have to deal with any of these things, but that's not something that's sort of, I think, as standard practice, if you will. So.
Can you talk a little bit about sort of how do these policies work together, right? If there's parking pricing reform, which, affects the way in which people drive, where they drive to and how much they drive, then what are some of those other, multimodal transportation options, and how do we sort of think about the sequencing of these policies together, right? Like bike lanes or bus rapid transit. Yeah.
I mean, I think the first thing is to sort of step back from the way you framed it and sort of acknowledge that there are lots of people who already don't partake in the parking dynamic. and don't drive, right? It's not this far off. It doesn't depend exclusively on rail. It's not this far off option. On this island alone, on Oahu, there's, even at the low end of the pandemic, there were 70,000 people taking the bus, daily. At a high end, it could be up to 200,000. We have people out there who are partaking all the time, and that's without the incentives or lack of incentives around parking. So I think it's always really important to start with that, is that we have this cultural discussion about how people don't do these other things, but on the ground, that's not true. There's lots of people doing these things. And so that's the first thing. And I think the second thing is that, I think the way Ordinance 2141 plays out is that we start to change them. It doesn't have to be, everything Donald Shoup said on the front end. We can try these different pieces. We can start managing on street more effectively in the places that it makes sense. We can eliminate the off street in the places that make sense. We can just start to work through some of these issues. And that really does change people's decision-making processes about their individual trips. Like, that's sort of the gnarly thing about transportation, right? The energy sector is only so many players for renewable energy, right? And there's only so many regulatory forces. Transportation has no real regulatory forces like that, and is the aggregation of the 1.4 million people, in the state. And so you just have to start working at them, essentially. And I think the other thing is talking about what we gain when we make these changes, that more housing can be built. One of the anecdotes that was reported in the Honolulu Star Advertiser was a project that was going to be a hotel in Waikiki and is now potentially going to be housing. Now, granted, it's probably not going to be cheap housing, but those are 20 units that were not going to be built last year. It's a little bit, but that little bit can make a big difference. And I think that that's really, and talking about how like those types of changes, if we can get it where you don't feel like you need a car, that's $8,000 in your pocket every year. And I think those are the types of things, which is like, you might actually be able to find parking at the beach instead of, just not doing it or deciding, well, I'm never going to go there again because I can never get parking. It does open up these spaces too, in a lot of ways, particularly for people who need them. Like if you're carpooling with a bunch of kids, like maybe that is the right parking for you. But if you're on if you could bus or you could bike, you're like, it's not worth it to me. And that space now opens up. I mean, there's a lot of dynamics at play. And I think we just have to start working on them, really, and supporting that change by recognizing that we do gain a lot when we do it.
Thanks, Katie. And just for our audience, the example that Katie just gave in Waikiki, right, it was specific to the minimum parking requirement ordinance change, because with a hotel, it is a different minimum parking requirement than residential units, and now it's able. Anyways, I just wanted to make that clear.
Yes. No, thank you.
It's a very strong example of an immediate response, right?
Yeah.
I know for our audience that we've run a little bit over. Sorry, I've taken some liberty with time, so we probably should wrap up soon here. But Katie, I just wanted to, in your role with the Ulupono Initiative, but also the many years of, planning expertise that you've had across the country, what do you see as, you talked about this sort of, both bold vision of change, but also incremental change over time. What do you see as the short-term and long-term steps forward from a policy framework?
Oh, well, it's not all policy. That's the problem. A big part of this is changing the conversation. I think that has to be both the short-term and the long-term discussion, because one of the places that people sort of interact with government really, really regularly are around development projects and around taking up parking spaces. That is usually the fastest thing to get people to show up to things. And so we really need to have a conversation about what happens when we defend those types of things. If you want fewer people parking in your neighborhood and you're worried about a new development, the best thing that can happen is that there isn't any parking with them, because the number of cars that will show up in your neighborhood will probably be less. That's a weird conversation to have because it's not intuitive. So I think that's one thing. I think the second thing is continuing on this space of, getting the on-street sort of monitored. There are still streets in Waikiki that are not metered at all and are essentially function as long-term car storage for people. That's probably not the best use of those resources, but even in our residential neighborhoods around trailheads, that's a really common one, is starting to change the conversations and manage them. We have plenty of parking. We have it. It's not being managed well necessarily. And rather than building more, which, could cost us anywhere from like $5,000 to $60,000 per stall, depending on what kind of parking and where here in Hawaii, we have options to talk about, like if you have to pay $1 an hour, are you really going to use it? I mean, like those are some of the real changes. And the land is just, I'm going to steal Dr. Shoup's line, which is land is expensive for people, but not for cars. And I think we really have to reassess that regularly. And this does hold true on some of the neighboring islands, although it does take a little different flavor, but the costs are the same. The opportunity costs are kind of, the same. And, one of the commenters from Kauai is, they're really dealing with a lot of parking issues. They have some of the more robust discussions with their state parks and their beaches about how to do that in a constrained space. So this isn't just subject to Waikiki, although a lot of our examples do come from there as a result of just sort of the way it plays out.
Thank you so much, Katie. Want to thank all of the speakers for joining us today, Katia and Professor Don Shoup. I really enjoyed this conversation. So in closing, I need to spend a little time to thank our partners. Thank you to Hawaii Community Foundation, Kamehameha Schools, and for these climate-related conversations, the State Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Commission. We also have serious support from the College of Social Sciences and the William S. Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii. Our lead co-sponsor of this event is the Ulupono Initiative, so mahalo. And we also have support from my homes at UH, which are the Institute for Sustainability and Resilience, the UH Economic Research Organization, or UHERO, and the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. The Better Tomorrow Speaker Series will be back with other events that address environmental, housing, and economic issues. And until then, thank you so much for listening in and submitting questions. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Aloha.